In the summer of 1941, the world watched in horror as Nazi Germany unleashed the largest military invasion in human history, Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed through the borders of the Soviet Union. The German High Command expected a swift, decisive collapse. They confidently believed the Red Army would fall within weeks, and Moscow would be captured before the onset of winter. But history had other plans. The Soviet Union did not collapse. The Red Army bled heavily, losing millions of men, but its will was not broken. As the freezing winter of 1941 set in, the German advance ground to a brutal halt outside the gates of Moscow. For the first time, the terrifying German blitzkrieg had failed. The situation grew even more perilous for Germany in December 1941, when the United States officially entered the global conflict. Suddenly, Adolf Hitler faced his worst strategic nightmare, a prolonged war of attrition against the world's greatest industrial powers simultaneously. Germany was running out of time, running out of manpower, and most critically, running out of oil. The modern, mechanized German war machine consumed millions of barrels of fuel. Without it, tanks could not move, aircraft could not fly, and industrial factories would grind to a halt. If Germany was to survive, it desperately needed a decisive victory that could end the war in the East. And for Hitler, the answer lay in the South. By 1942, the Soviet Union's lifeblood flowed from the rich oil fields of the Caucasus region, which produced over 80% of the USSR's total oil supply. To Hitler, this was the ultimate strategic prize. If Germany could seize the Caucasus, they would fuel their own empire for years while simultaneously starving the Soviet military to death. On June 28, 1942, Germany launched its massive summer offensive, codenamed Operation Blue. Initially, the attack achieved spectacular success. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, had stubbornly anticipated that Germany would launch another assault on Moscow, leaving the southern front heavily vulnerable and undermanned. German armored formations raced across the vast, open Russian steppes, sweeping aside Soviet defenses with ease. Cities fell in rapid succession. To the outside world, it looked as though Germany was on the verge of total victory in the East, and the Soviet Union was finally breaking. But beneath this brilliant tactical success lay deep, fatal flaws. The Wehrmacht was moving too fast for its own supply lines, which now stretched for hundreds of miles over hostile, underdeveloped terrain. Fuel shortages became chronic, forcing advanced units to halt for days. Heavy transport trains could not deliver ammunition quickly enough to keep pace with the armor. More dangerously, while the German army was exhausting its resources, the Soviet Union was quietly raising fresh, massive new armies in the deep rear of the country. It was at this critical juncture, on July 23, 1942, that Adolf Hitler made a reckless decision that would alter the course of human history. Overconfident from early victories, he issued Führer Directive No. 45. He ordered his forces in the south to split into two separate army groups, pursuing two massive objectives simultaneously. Army Group A was ordered to continue south into the Caucasus Mountains to seize the oil fields. Army Group B was ordered to drive east toward the Volga River to capture the industrial city of Stalingrad. His generals protested vigorously. Splitting the army meant that neither offensive would have enough concentrated strength to succeed. But Hitler was stubborn. He was no longer thinking merely about military strategy. He was consumed by political symbolism. Stalingrad was a major industrial hub manufacturing tanks and artillery, but it also proudly bore the name of his bitter rival, Joseph Stalin. For Hitler, capturing the city would be a devastating psychological blow to the Soviet regime. For Stalin, losing the city that carried his name was absolutely unthinkable. In response, Stalin issued the famous Order No. 227 to the Red Army, not a step back. Anyone who retreated without direct orders would face immediate execution. The stage was set for an apocalyptic clash of wills. On August 23, 1942, the sky over Stalingrad turned black. The German Luftwaffe unleashed a catastrophic bombing campaign, raining thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs down onto the largely wooden city. Within hours, Stalingrad was transformed into a raging ocean of fire. Over 40,000 civilians lost their lives in the opening days alone, and the city's skyline was erased. The Germans believed this terrifying display of air power would instantly break the Soviet will to fight. In reality, it had the exact opposite effect. Instead of destroying the defense, the bombing transformed Stalingrad into a perfect, impenetrable fortress. The collapsed buildings, shattered factories, and cratered streets completely eliminated the maneuvering advantage of German tanks. The Wehrmacht entered a concrete labyrinth, a nightmare world that the German soldiers began to call Rat in Krieg or Rat War. The combat inside the city became agonizingly personal and brutal. The Soviet defense was led by General Vasily Chukov, a ruthless and brilliant commander. Chukov realized that the Germans held overwhelming superiority in long-range artillery and air support. His solution was a tactical innovation known as hugging the enemy. He ordered his soldiers to position themselves within mere yards of the German lines. If the Germans wanted to call in an airstrike or artillery barrage, they would risk killing their own men. The war was now fought room by room, staircase by staircase, and attic by attic. A single apartment building, like the famous Pavlov's house, was held by a handful of Soviet soldiers who resisted waves of German infantry and tank attacks for months. Factories changed hands multiple times in a single day, leaving the floors littered with casualties. In this grim landscape of smoke, iron, and rubble, a deadly new terror emerged: the Soviet sniper. Hidden expertly among the debris, snipers turned the city into a psychological meat grinder for German troops. Among them, Vasily Zaitsev became a legendary figure, credited with killing over 200 enemy soldiers in a matter of weeks. The fear of an unseen bullet meant German soldiers could no longer step into an open street during daylight without facing instant death. The psychological strain was breaking the morale of the attackers. By October, autumn turned to a bitter, unforgiving winter. The temperatures began to plummet far below freezing. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, had managed to capture over 90% of the ruined city, but they could not eliminate the final stubborn Soviet pockets clinging to the cliffs on the banks of the Volga River. Every single night, under the cover of darkness, Soviet boats crossed the freezing river under heavy artillery fire to deliver fresh reinforcements, food, and ammunition to the defenders. The Germans were exhausted, depleted, and completely focused on the ruins directly in front of them. They failed to notice the massive trap being laid behind them, while General Paulus poured his best troops into the meat grinder of Stalingrad. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov was preparing a masterpiece of military operational strategy. He had noticed a fatal flaw in the German deployment. To keep all their elite forces concentrated inside the city, the Germans had left their vast northern and southern flanks guarded largely by their Axis allies, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops. These soldiers were brave, but they were poorly equipped, lacked anti-tank weapons, and held lines that were stretched dangerously thin. On November 19, 1942, the trap was sprung under the codename Operation Uranus. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, supported by 1,500 tanks and thousands of heavy artillery pieces, launched a massive, coordinated double envelopment. The Romanian lines on the flanks crumbled almost instantly under the overwhelming weight of the Soviet armor. The breakthrough was swift and unstoppable. Just 4 days later, on November 23, the northern and southern Soviet spearheads met near the town of Kaluk. The pincer movement was complete. The German Sixth Army, along with thousands of Axis auxiliary troops, more than 200, and 50,000 men in total, was completely surrounded and cut off from the rest of the German front. General Paulus immediately recognized the danger and begged Hitler for permission to break out of the pocket while they still possessed the fuel and strength to do so. Hitler strictly refused. He ordered the Sixth Army to stand firm, declaring Stalingrad a fortress. He falsely promised that Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe would supply the encircled troops entirely by air. It was a promise that proved mathematically and physically impossible to keep. The Luftwaffe could only deliver a tiny fraction of the required tons of food, fuel, and ammunition each day, while losing hundreds of transport planes to Soviet anti-aircraft fire and fighters. Winter tightened its icy grip on the pocket. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. Starvation, severe frostbite, and typhus ravaged the trapped, desperate army. German soldiers ate their transport horses, chewed on pieces of leather, and burned their own boots and frozen furniture simply for a few minutes of warmth. A desperate rescue attempt launched from outside the pocket by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, named Operation Winter Storm, failed to break through the tightening Soviet ring. The Sixth Army was abandoned to its grim fate. By January 1943, all hope within the Stalingrad pocket had vanished, replaced by a grim despair. Exhausted, starving, and freezing in the brutal Russian winter, The German troops could no longer resist the relentless Soviet assaults designed to liquidate the pocket. Soviet artillery pulverized the remaining positions, compressing the trapped Sixth Army into an ever-shrinking wasteland of ice. Ammunition was down to the final rounds, and the daily ration had dwindled to a single frozen crust of bread. On January 31, 1943, recognizing the absolute futility of further slaughter, General Friedrich Paulus surrendered from his squalid headquarters in the basement of a ruined department store. Just hours prior, Hitler had promoted Paulus to field marshal, a sinister directive encouraging him to commit suicide, as no German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Paulus refused and surrendered. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last remaining Axis resistance ended, and the guns along the Volga River finally fell silent. The total cost of the Battle of Stalingrad was staggering, defying human imagination. Over 5 agonizing months, both sides suffered nearly 2 million casualties, making it an industrialized slaughterhouse on an unprecedented scale. The city itself was reduced to a mountain of toxic ash and twisted iron. The immediate aftermath was just as horrific. A miserable column of 91,000 gaunt German prisoners was marched off into the Siberian wastes. Ravaged by typhus and starvation, thousands died on the roads. Out of those 91,000 men who entered captivity, only about 5,000 broken survivors would ever return home to Germany alive, with the last group released more than a decade later. In 1955, Stalingrad was the definitive turning point of the Second World War. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered forever. From this monumental moment onward, Germany would never again possess the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The Red Army had broken the spine of the Wehrmacht, forcing the German war machine into an agonizing defensive retreat all the way back to the ruined streets of Berlin. On the frozen banks of the Volga River, the tide of World War II had turned, and the total destruction of the Nazi regime was permanently sealed.